All right, what a fantastic way to start the morning. We're going to keep the program moving along. Thank you to Joe, to Secretary-elect Fontes, and to Secretary Benson for great discussion to get us started. I'm going to go ahead and bring up our next panel as we now shift from the work of protecting our democracy and the election system to the ongoing work by state and local leaders that is showing how government can work to improve people's lives. So we'll give folks a moment, but Oregon Treasurer Tobias Read is going to lead our discussion.
All right, are we ready here? We're going to get started. There's too much energy in this room. We have to get going with our next discussion. I'm Tobias Read. I have the honor of serving as State Treasurer in Oregon. And before anything else, I want to add my name to the list of people attempting to express my gratitude to the entire New Deal team, particularly Debbie and Helen, for creating this community. I say yes every time I get a chance to be with all of you because you're such a source of energy and inspiration to keep doing this work that has to be done. So my thanks to all of you for being my home away from home. I'm also really excited to be part of this conversation this morning because I think it represents so much of where we are, both in terms of challenges and opportunities. We're going to talk about how to deliver on the promises that are in front of us. And there's no more important time for that to happen, as Secretary Donovan says, in the wake of the three uncles, Uncle Bill, Uncle Chip, and Uncle Ira. I heard that this morning, and I really liked it.
Thanks to Uncle Joe.
Yes, that's right. The other uncle, exactly. But I think this is one of the challenging things about being part of a community like this that believes in the power of government to do good things, that we have to prove it. We have to execute on these things. And that's challenging in a time like this that's full of so much cynicism and so many roadblocks. It can be tempting, of course, to try to blame Republicans for that, and sometimes that's justified. But I'm from Oregon, where Democrats have been in control for a very long time. So I want to give you that view from the West Coast as we get started. It's not necessarily a pretty picture, but I'm not the only one here from Oregon, so you don't have to take my word for it. You can check on this. We're not building housing fast enough in Oregon. We're not adjusting to the realities of climate change, and we're certainly not getting federal dollars to work quickly enough. And it's not Republicans who are standing in the way of Portland building transitional housing, getting more Oregonians off the street. It used to be in Oregon that lawmakers could say we hadn't allocated sufficient resources to do that work, but I don't think that is an argument that passes the smell test anymore. It's something I tried to make a point of in my last campaign, not successfully, unfortunately. But the point remains, voters are mad and they are frustrated at how slow we are. It's not a malicious effort, I don't think, on the part of government to underperform, but I think it's a result of our very well-intentioned effort to make sure our processes are inclusive and transparent and that they avoid disagreement. And those are all things we should continue to seek, of course, but we can't let that desire for consensus get in the way of our willingness to move fast to address these emergent needs. I can, of course, point to some innovative ideas in Oregon around our ban on exclusive single-family zoning, some workforce housing, workforce partnerships, but those are just examples that have promise without the data to back them up yet, and they don't stand up to public sentiment. We see every day in Oregon examples of people and companies moving away from the city or the state because they're fed up. And it worries me that so much of our decision-making on the part of business is motivated by their lack of confidence in government. So why do we expect voters to be any different? And yet, this is where I want to give a little bit of optimism, we somehow avoided disaster at the ballot. There's a new Democratic governor that's going to take office next month. There are majorities in the House and the Senate that held on, so there's still opportunities in front of us despite all these challenges that I've described. And it was close, but voters have given us another chance. What worries me is that it might be our last chance unless we get things together and keep moving forward. they haven't thrown out the baby with the bathwater yet, but they might. And if we're not delivering results, quantifiable, I think even in Oregon, will probably lose the privilege of governing. So the lesson for me from that far-flung place that too many of you call Oregon is that we can't let this desire for unanimity, for our nervousness about being criticized or getting something wrong, get in the way of making common sense decisions and delivering results for Oregonians. So that is why I'm excited to have this conversation today with three people who are on the front lines, delivering results, building confidence, and giving us examples. And I think it would be incredibly foolish and wasteful of me to try to describe their collective experiences and their very impressive resumes. We'd use up all our time on that. So what I want to do is just give a couple of sentences about these impressive people, ask them an intentionally vague question that lets them talk about whatever they want and introduce themselves rather than me. And then heads up, I think we've all been in the audience of panels that are boring because the people on the stage just talk to each other. So nearly as soon as that first set of questions is done, we're coming to you. So if I know anything about the New Deal group, I know you're not going to be shy at adding to this conversation and keeping it going. So get ready, please. So you all know Secretary Shaun Donovan. He's been part of multiple administrations, multiple cabinets, the local, the state, the federal level. He's now at the Ford Foundation. And I have to say, I may slip up. There is a Ford Family Foundation in Oregon. And so every time I start to say Ford, sometimes family slips in. It'll be unintentional if that happens. But the Ford Foundation, building capacity, particularly in communities as it relates to infrastructure. So excited to have him here. And we have two other fantastic people as well. Andi Phillips, who is at the center of that public and private sector at Maycomb Capital, making sure that capital is unleashed to transform communities. She's been a pioneer on social impact bonds, something that many New Dealers are familiar with, and so we're excited to have you. And Mayor Q, Quinton Lucas, the mayor of the great city of Kansas City, having served now for 3 years, I think, 2019, after a history on the city council as well. He's born and raised in Kansas City, and as if being mayor is not enough, you're also on the law school faculty at the University of Kansas. So we got three great experts here, and we're all going to learn a lot. So let me start with you, Mr. Secretary. Would you please sort of fill us in on what you're doing with the Ford Foundation, making sure that we're maximizing the impact of the three uncles, thanks to Uncle Joe, and how, as a former cabinet official, these talented state and local folks can be most effective in interacting with the federal government. Please.
Yeah. So great to be with so many old friends and some new friends this morning. And maybe to try to build a little bit of a bridge to the last conversation we just had, which was incredibly inspiring. I think part of the reason that there is fertile ground in some places for the liars, the folks that would steal our democracy. Yes, it's social media, lack of journalism. There are lots of reasons, but one of them is this issue that you started to touch on, that if folks don't believe that their government is working for them, if they don't see the ways in which investment transforms their lives, then they become open to listening to the lies. And so for me, what is so remarkable about this moment is that we have the single biggest opportunity of our lifetimes to take federal investment and put it to work in our communities. And the truth is that, and I say this as a very jealous former budget director who wishes I had had these resources when I was there, we're not going to get this moment again. And so the upside is that we can make change, you all can make change in ways that we never have before and never will again. The downside of that is if we don't deliver, that we will feed this monster more and more. No pressure, no pressure. But that is the moment we find ourselves in, maybe appropriately to say, this is the new Deal we're living in. And so the question is, how do we make sure that translates into a difference in people's lives? And the piece that I am working on right now is to say, yes, there may be trillions of dollars out there, but what are the ways in which philanthropy can work effectively with government to do things that government dollars and government people, all of you, can't do by yourselves? And part of that is, and we just had a great session, thank you to New Deal for arranging it with many local leaders, talking about this. Part of it is just, frankly, how do you help us make sense of this alphabet soup of programs that are out there? For lots of communities, it's a question of, like, I don't have a grant writer. Much like, there are 37 grants that I'm hearing about. How am I actually going to just respond to that? And the truth is, a federal government can't pay you to apply for their programs, right? It doesn't work that way. And so there are gaps like that, building technical assistance, building capacity on the ground, that philanthropy can be uniquely applicable for. And the project that I'm building with Laurel Blatchford, my partner who's here in the room, hey Laurel, who I've worked with for almost 2 decades in public service, we are trying to make sure that we can bring tens of millions of dollars from philanthropies across the country, hopefully hundreds of millions of dollars even, into supporting communities with the nuts and bolts of how do you learn about programs, how do you apply for them, and then how do you effectively execute. And so that's a very, very broad thing, lots of things we're looking at, but some particular things that we're hearing across the country on the ground that we are starting to focus on as well. One is a lot of concern that we've got a job market where it is hard to find people. And we're going to be building all of this stuff with the trillions of dollars that's coming in. How do we hire people? How do we make sure that we can actually execute on this? The flip side of that is, if there were ever a moment to bring folks who have been locked out of good jobs, we talked about formerly incarcerated people a few minutes ago in our focus group upstairs. People of color, women into jobs and infrastructure that have been locked out for a long time. This is the moment to do it. It's a huge opportunity, but that means investing in training programs and other efforts that really bring those folks in. So the workforce piece is something we're starting to focus on a lot. Another thing, we have an opportunity, 25 years of water funding to get rid of lead pipes, to build drinking infrastructure that's in the infrastructure law. 25 years of money, so huge opportunity. But again, how do we execute on that? And part of it is building capacity, but there are also some incredibly innovative solutions out there that we're trying to make sure philanthropy can help spread. Let me just be specific here. There's now technology that will allow you to figure out where a lead pipe is, right? Sounds simple, but the truth is, the chances right now, if you just go dig, are about 1 in 5 that you'll find the lead pipe which you dig. Using data from local communities, but also artificial intelligence, we can bring that to 4 in 5, to 80% chance that which dramatically speeds up, like 5 times or faster, the process of finding them and replacing them, and dramatically brings down cost, right? That's something that philanthropy can invest in and help all of you as communities put to work. There are lots of solutions like that that are things that we're looking at trying to fund and scale across the country. And then a third area is, and we hear this all the time, how do I communicate to folks what I'm actually doing in communities? How do I know whether my project is actually advancing racial equity or improving climate goals, right? And so there's a big investment that we've got to make in the data, the metrics, the accountability around this. And just to be a little more political for a second, we're also hearing a lot, I'm in a local government where my governor is of a different party, doesn't share my goals, right? How do you create an accountability infrastructure where we can be saying, guess what? State funded transportation funding isn't going to the right places. It isn't going out equitably. How do you create both the data itself, and then an advocacy, whether it's through local press, really the visibility that will hold leaders accountable across the country for investing this money in the people and the places where it should go. So those are three areas that we've decided we're going to do more work on. But we're also doing a lot of listening. We're here. We look forward to your questions and input on where else the pain points are, what help do you need, and where philanthropy could be helpful through this infrastructure exchange that we built to make sure that you can deliver on this promise. Again, no pressure. The New Deal moment. Together, we can make this work and hopefully restore confidence in our government, in local government, in the federal government, as an institution that makes a difference in people's lives.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Ms. Phillips, can you tell us about your Community Outcomes Fund? I want to particularly hear about how you think about public-private partnerships and how they can contribute to long-term success and how you measure that.
Sure. Well, it is great to be here, and I was, I think, like everybody in the room, completely inspired and more hopeful than I thought I would be after the panel this morning. And I would agree with both of you that part of how we keep this more positive momentum for democracy is about the change we're making in communities. And I loved what you said. Two things jumped out at for me. One was a sense of urgency, because that is what we need. And when we think about the work we do, we're very focused on partnering with folks in local and state government and saying, how can we help you achieve your goals, not 2 years from now, but in real time? So that's something that's very important for us. What's also really important for us is data and accountability, and that is at the very core of what we do. So about 6 years ago, I founded the Community Outcomes Fund, and what we are is a flexible, impact-aligned debt fund. And what we do is partner with folks in local communities to really invest not in infrastructure, not in the bricks and mortar of communities, but instead help those communities invest in the people who live there. And really, sort of this work that we're doing today is sort of version 2.0 of something that started about 10 years ago. And I think what has been a topic of conversation among New Deal leaders over time, which is this idea of a social impact bond. And how do you sort of use private sector capital to invest in communities and align public dollars with outcomes? And really what we think about what we are trying to do, and the core of that work is twofold. One is it's about how you spend the money, not necessarily what you're spending the money on. But it really goes back to this piece about transparency and accountability. We all know that local government largely contracts out a lot of the work in human services, workforce development, early education. I would argue, and I have been on the sort of recipient of those grant dollars from government for a very, very long time and have managed hundreds of millions of dollars in those contracts. What I would argue and what we're really focused on is it is about what you spend the money on, but it's also about how you spend the money. And I'm going to turn back time a little over 20 years and show my age to another moment when there was a large federal policy change. And it meant a lot of dollars were going into communities. And that was in the late 90s with welfare reform, when all of a sudden there were TANF dollars going into local communities that weren't just for cash assistance, but were there to help people get into jobs. At that moment in time, New York City made the decision to upend the way they had let those contracts. They did a typical RFP like we've all been involved in. At that moment in time, what it meant was we responded to that RFP by literally bringing a box down to the offices because we had to have 10 hard copies, 3 unbound, 7 bound. This is, I'm dating myself here. But when we went in, when we were told we were one of the awardees, we went in to talk about the terms of the contract, and they said, yeah, we're not doing it the old way of cost reimbursement where you tell us how much you spend and we just reimburse what you spend. what we're going to do is pay you based on actually placing people in jobs and actually helping people retain those jobs at 3 and 6 months. At the time, it was a Republican mayor. We did not necessarily, our team, share his political beliefs, and we were horrified that this is what they were going to do. 6 months later, we all did a 180, because what we realized was not only did what you measure matter, what you pay for matters. And what it meant was, when we were thinking about the services we were delivering, we were laser focused on the outcomes we wanted to get for those folks who were using their precious time to come to our programs. And so what we did was we had the data, we looked at the data, and we used it to drive better performance. So on the one hand, that project was hugely successful. For me personally, it really hammered home that it's not just about what you fund, but it's actually about the very nerdy, wonky work of how you fund it. But we didn't get everything right, because what happened was, basically, the city had transferred all of the risk of impact to the nonprofit and service provider sector. And we weren't actually well positioned to manage that risk. We didn't have big balance sheets to be able to manage that. And even more important, we had to scramble to find money to deliver the services and wait to be paid for outcomes. When the early work of social impact bonds happened, what we did was we changed that, because we added something very, very important, which was the component of the public-private partnership. And that's important for the reason of, we want to get investment dollars in there so folks have the money they need to operate to get to those outcomes. It's also important because it means that the service providers aren't, holding on to risk on their own, and so they are sharing that risk with those investors. But what we've also seen that's, I think, as important is there is something about that three-legged stool of a public-private partnership that I really believe drives better outcomes. And that what you are doing is bringing those sectors together on a regular basis to look at data. That really means that you are leveraging all of your community's resources to get to those positive outcomes. And you don't have to just believe it because I'm saying it. I'm going to call out my friend Mayor Harris, who's in the back there. All right, so Mayor Harris got a woohoo, good. So we did this in Shelby County in partnership with Mayor Harris and his team and the county councilors around pre-K. So about 4 years ago, the county made a commitment for 100% needs-based pre-K. And what this meant was that every low-income 4-year-old would have access to a seat in high-quality pre-K. What they said, though, was we're not just going to do it business as usual. We're going to put our dollars on the table, but we are going to align those dollars with the outcomes we care about. We want to make sure there's consistent attendance because we know that that's correlated with long-term academic success. We want to look at pre-K literacy skills, and we want to look at kindergarten readiness. We invested in that project alongside a group of amazing local partners, who I won't name all of them, but trust me on that. And then very quickly, COVID hit. And if I had thought it was a good thing to do to invest in pre-K in Memphis, I really believed in the program. When there was a global pandemic and we were talking about hybrid or video pre-K, I wasn't so sure. It was a little bit of a moment. But what I will say that happened in that community is the county, the providers, us as the investors, and our local investors came together and said, how do we think about success in this new virtual pre-K environment? Needless to say, attendance didn't look like attendance did when it was in real life. That coming together, I really believe, set these programs up for success. And what is most impressive is, at the end of that hybrid year of pre-K, 70% of our kids, based on a normed assessment, and I do feel like they're our kids, Mayor Harris, if you will allow me, were assessed as on track with pre-literacy kids as compared to 60% nationwide, keeping in mind that ours are an entirely low-income cohort. So I think and we have had similarly glowing results with kindergarten readiness, where we are really closing the readiness gap with higher income peers. And so what we've seen is that in this world of sort of what I would call social impact bonds 2.0, we can get dollars out faster. We can actually create this accountability and this virtuous circle by bringing in this public-private partnership. So.
It's terrific. Thank you. All right, Mr. Mayor, I've been saving you for last because you are in a unique position to react to these high-minded ideals and abstract theories. What's really happening on the ground? How do you navigate this, as the Secretary said, this alphabet soup, and make sure that you're getting the most impact, both in terms of dollars and in terms of impact?
Well, first of all, thank you all for letting me spend time with you. I am delighted to see my sister from the Great Plains, Mayor Baird from Lincoln, Nebraska. Thank you for being here with us today, and so many others. I just like to find other Midwesterners in a room. It gets me very comfortable. And for those who are just getting to know me, actually, you described me in the bio.
Very shortly. Please do expand.
And I'll just give a short descriptor. During the high point of the pandemic, I had a number of critics, like every mayor, every leader did. And they started calling me a nickname based on the discount grocery store Aldi. And they called me Aldi Brand Obama, because I'm a law professor and all of that, and I grew to love it, right? They just said, oh, Aldi Brand Obama at it again, or something of that sort. So I consider myself kind of a discount university professor, public official, who's here to just give you the best value possible while we're together. I know, right? And shout out to Aldi, get some great deals. A few things about how we can actually share with the public what we're doing is breaking down the communication gap that happens at times. When we talk about reporting back, often in local government, we'll say, but we do have a list. And indeed, for years we have. We say, look at our final citizen satisfaction surveys, look at what we've done. And the public largely says, I don't get that. And so for me, communication, and frankly the points that we're working on now, is important about branding. So for us, our American Rescue Plan funds, we're known largely as Rebuild KC. And indeed, there's almost this relationship in the city with Rebuild KC that's very different than there are a lot of federal funds, they're going a lot of places, and there's a big fight about them. The other thing that I think that we've done is important is making sure that we're repetitive in some way with the work that we're doing. When I was running for mayor, and it's so interesting for those of you who've run for office, and you all know this, right? You think that when you start, you'll give these great flowery speeches about how you'll change the world, and then it just gets summarized to Quinton Lucas, potholes, public safety, and progress, the 3 Ps. And in many ways, making sure you tie back to that in connection even with new programs, new models, new foundations with which you're working has been so important for us in Kansas City. So on infrastructure, right, that is fundamentally the potholes point. Now, we didn't use ARPA funds or any infrastructure funds to directly fill potholes, but there are a few things, right, that you're able to do. Expanding your infrastructure investments, addressing issues that have been concerns to Kansas Cityans for long times, and really speaking to the challenge they felt with potholes, how they get around the city in a whole new way. And in some way, even leveraging, we have a zero-fare transit program in my city, saying that really the whole pothole point is about transportation, how you move about the city, access to more of our community. So that's that one area there. When we talk about progress, I kind of cheated on that because that's so broad, right? You can talk about education, housing, but really making sure that we're saying, and we used it really for housing, that our affordable housing investments, just a few weeks ago, we passed our city's first housing trust fund bond. We're very proud of that. And saying, thank you, we've learned from you. And so saying in some ways that this is that key progress point. And then making sure, importantly, in public safety, which has been a fascinating area over the last several years to be a mayor, making sure you're trying in ways to avoid some of the debates and the discussions, right? Having people who will shout defund or the opposite. And instead saying, well, for us, coming up with these new creative solutions to violent crime, address issues that we think about a lot. For example, when I talk about public safety, I've really taken to, instead of saying policing or other issues, saying, I don't want kids shot in school. Whether that's from a random shooter, someone within, anything under the sun. How can we make sure that we have resources in our community, including mental health, training for faculty, gun control, to address issues like avoiding those? And so for us, I think in local government, it is making sure first, of course, that you use the tools well, that you avoid the desire that happens in every local government to actually fill so many budget gaps, and we have all of them. But also making sure that as you're deploying those, tying back to the original communication that you were doing in connection with it again and again. And on one point, in dealing with governors that are of a different political party than you, something I deal with each and every day, it's fascinating. I still remember when I first became mayor, I started kind of answering it the wrong way. My governor has a southern twang, which I do not, so I started saying more daggums in my speeches, which wasn't actually the effective way to do it, so imitation was not the best approach. But really actually talking about your community's success. In the same way that the governor wants to come to your community and talk about a successful football team, if you're blessed with one, or anything under the sun, we started saying, and importantly inviting, to say, look at what we are doing in housing development. In housing, the most interesting thing, our soon-to-be senior United States Senator is a man by the name of Josh Hawley. We're not close. But nonetheless, when we talk about housing, we started actually talking about work that Kansas City is doing to help support our supply of single-family housing, housing preservation, something that at least he said, oh, families. And I was like, yes, we have those too. And in some way looking to build that link long term. So I guess in a very simple summary, it is effective deployment, but tying that deployment to the same communicating that you've been doing for some time. And then, of course, repeating it again and again, how these successes tie to what your city is fundamentally working on. And importantly, making sure, I mean, our Housing Trust Fund bond actually arose from American Rescue Plan funds because we said, we can do this, we can start to build things, but what's next? And so making sure we're using this moment to help tell the public, this is next, this is important, and the track we're on in Kansas City is something that's rising long term.
Terrific. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Okay, we want to hear from you now. Not all at once, though. I've got some questions if you guys don't yet, but I gave you fair warning here. I'm going to cold call people in a minute. Claude, please, right up front.
Thanks, Tobias.
You got right on the other side of using the mic, Claude. There you go.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. Tobias, thank you.
Thank you.
Since I've spent my career working on international issues for corporate clients primarily, everything that the three of you have been talking about are directly relevant to America's ability to thrive in the future, as we've experienced. For those of us who have traveled internationally over the last 20 years, we've seen the rise of the rest. Americans are acutely aware of our competition with China, and by the way, if you've been in China within the last 10 to 20 years, you know that our infrastructure is an absolute joke compared to theirs, which seems like science fiction compared to ours. But the rest of the world is rising as well. Infrastructure, education, the ability to have an inclusive economy, because our population without expanded legal immigration is relatively stagnant compared to much of the world. So we've got to make the most of every single American. Do you see this as at all relevant in these debates about what we ought to be doing to move ahead, or is it more about sort of just the local kitchen table issues? Because the international context is really going to have a huge impact on the world that our kids live in.
we could talk about these issues for another hour because we think things are complex at home, and they are, right? The world is increasingly complex, and a war in Ukraine, anti-democratic forces that are emerging across the globe, a whole different range of issues. And the growing inequality that we've seen in the US that's driven a lot of these is also happening overseas. I think for me, a couple points that are particularly interesting around the three uncles, as I called them. First, that for all maybe a silver lining of COVID is that we are now focused on the fact that if China's producing, half or more of the goods that we're bringing to the U.S., that puts us in a position where not only on national security, but just plain economics, that we can't deliver what we need in this country. So I think there is a huge opportunity as we think about manufacturing and the jobs that might come that are directly supported in CHIPS and also in the Inflation Reduction Act in a way that we have tools now that we've never had. And as local leaders, thinking about ways, particularly for folks who may not have a college degree, building pathways into the middle class in jobs that we had kind of written off in the U.S. 10 years ago. I think that the wrinkle I would add to that is that the Inflation Reduction Act, not only has it allowed us, and we saw this at the climate conference just a couple of weeks ago, allowed President Biden to go and say we are leading again in the U.S. and to push the world on a climate transition. What's interesting about it is we now know that in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to get to a place where if you haven't electrified your home, you will be paying far more for energy than you should be. And yet, the problem is, if you think about the low-income folks in your communities, if we're not investing in electrifying their homes, in bringing in heat pumps, in all of that, we're going to essentially have energy apartheid in this country. We'll end up with wealthy people being able to make that transition and low-income folks not. And so folks who already don't have enough money are going to be paying more than they should for energy, and we'll see pollution differences and a whole range of other things continue. So for me, one of the really interesting opportunities of this moment is to think about how do you as leaders in your local communities make sure, and there are lots of creative ways that we can bring capital in, because we know it pays for itself now, right? If you can bring in the money to electrify a home, you're going to lower costs in the future. That sounds like something you could finance against, right, with private capital. There's a huge opportunity to bring innovation to this, but there's a huge risk, too, that we're going to further exacerbate the divides that we have in this country. The last thing I would just say about that, making that transition means building a lot of things, right? It means jobs for electricians and others. It means building heat pumps. And so this idea that we could be a manufacturing country again, that we could put folks to work in jobs that don't require advanced degrees, massive opportunity in the climate transition that we know now we have the economics, the tax incentives and other things in place long term that will allow us to. So that even adds to this idea that we could begin building rebuilding a manufacturing base in a way that we haven't had the opportunity to do before.
So I would just add to that a couple projects that we've been involved with that are more sort of thinking about these issues on the local level, sort of the tough time businesses are having hiring, yet still high levels of poverty in a lot of communities. And these projects in particular really looked at sort of untapped talent pools in their community and said, how can we get those untapped talent pools either back in the labor market or with the skills they need to meet where we have a pressing need? We just financed a project in the greater Denver area around training paraprofessionals, sort of teachers' aides who have tremendous classroom experience, are often people of color, predominantly people of color, in sort of dead-end jobs in classrooms, to recruit those folks into teacher training programs to address the very grave teacher shortage that schools are facing, but as important, the diversity crisis. That is not unique to the greater Denver schools. And so I think it's just a good example of saying, how do we think about what is exactly the gap? What are the assets we have in our community that we can, with some targeted investment, some deep alignment around outcomes, can we get to sort of grow your own economic development?
Mr. Mayor, anything you want to add to that?
You know, I'll just say very briefly, it is highly relevant what's happening in other countries. However, we have to make sure in our own either mayor's offices and cities that international offices and affairs don't become the thing of novelties. Don't become the sort of thing where it is a one-off, perhaps, and I love cultural exchanges with the best of them, but that we're trying to actually make sure that we're taking either best practices, academic exchanges, workforce exchanges, in connection with what we're trying to do and deliver. And so for me, I've been able to deploy ideas from other countries, even experts from other countries best, usually in the infrastructure space, because there aren't that many new airports built, for example, or perhaps you can take housing models, water models, which has been a big issue for us in Kansas City, even though we're fairly resource rich. And so for me, I think that the biggest step for us will be long-term, making sure that as we build out RFPs for the future, as we're looking at design standards and models, we're ensuring first that we have some openness in our own policy to look at more creative ideas and uses and techniques, that we don't give an overwhelming preference to repeat players that have presented before the city or the state again and again. I mean, to break way too big of an argument right now on our minority and women representation goals, we're very favorable towards the few incumbents that might exist in Missouri and Kansas, and me being one, I love us too. That said, right, there are diverse offerings from a number of different folks far beyond. And so I think actually in the deployment of how we do local government, you will get the best solution there. And importantly, I think everybody always does have this issue of how do you get the public to care or to recognize beyond just seeing the conflict on television or some other issue. I think it is value long-term. And it is distilling issues, let's say climate sustainability, to very applicable issues towards them. In Kansas City, Missouri, right, our asthma infection rates in the black community versus majority white communities 1 to 2 miles away are drastically different. And there are solutions, the secretary already mentioned, that we're working on that can help address them. People get that. People get a model from another community anywhere in the world that speaks to those sorts of solutions. And so I do think that that's the way that we can speak to international issues, affairs, and models without just getting folks to perhaps roll their eyes and say, I'd rather listen to you talk about the aforementioned pothole.
What's next? We have other questions? Well, I'll ask one. Oh, please.
Hi, y'all. State Representative Kate Farrar from Connecticut. Two things. One, around how we communicate about all of this incredible investment, and I so appreciate your 3 Ps, Mayor. But one of the things that I think we've been hearing the last couple of days is certainly the branding of this, the data points, but today, especially in hearing from you all this morning, I couldn't help be reminded about not losing sight of the stories we tell, since stories trump data every day. And I hope that that's something that we can certainly think about how we're lifting up those stories and not just the data. But particularly with philanthropy, I was so intrigued, especially from your kind of standpoint at the national level, what you would recommend for us at the state level in what we're communicating to our largest funders and philanthropic partners at the state level about how we work together beyond just kind of your vantage point at the national level.
Go ahead, please.
I'll start with what I try to do, and they'll tell me if I'm wrong. I think on the communication that we try to do, first, you do need to be a credible actor in terms of what you're doing. So laying out past successes, but also the programmatic efforts that you're looking at, I think has been our step one, at least in what has been funded. I think, to your point, though, the narrative is so important. And so many of us have talked about reconnecting communities grants. My own city has worked with that with Accelerator for America. And I think what's important for us with that has been really speaking to the broader concerns that we're addressing from that finite issue. And so some of that has been conveyed simply through our own broad-based media communications, trying to get even some national interest in what's happening from that perspective, and then using that when we're speaking to funders, both more local, state-based, regional foundations and beyond, to say, well, look at the work that we're doing, look at our commitment that we've made already through local funds and state and federal grants, and importantly, look at how your dollars can truly be leveraged in a way that will help us not just succeed in this mission, but really build this kind of truly small F, foundational effort long term that changes Kansas City. And that's usually what we're doing in terms of the conversations that we're having. What we are not simply doing is trying to gap fill, which has always been a poor idea. We're not trying to very simply say, we have a long-standing connection with you, and I was on a panel, so I'm going to call you right after. And what we're really trying to, I think, create a more permanent approach for in Kansas City is, and we funded our own new grant officer just in the mayor's office. We've had it before, and they were hiding out in the police department and a few other places, but making sure that where our policy work is really being done, we're making a central part of that the idea of how we communicate grants to every possible party with which we would work.
So just one more thing I would say on the communication piece that's not nearly as eloquent as the mayor, but one of the things we hear a lot from local communities is like, I don't have a budget for communications, right? And the federal government, there's lots of things in trillions of dollars of spending that they will fund, the alphabet soup. They're not going to fund PR agencies. They're not going to fund comms, right? And so one of the things that at least some foundations, Bloomberg Philanthropies in their local infrastructure hub, and other, there is money potentially available to help you build the capacity for storytelling. And that is just an area where I think it's worth thinking about with your local philanthropies. I think a couple points I would make on local philanthropies. I think I mentioned we've spoken to and are working with over 50, but mostly national philanthropies. But in my career, I've worked a lot with local, state, or local community foundations as well. And I think two things I would suggest. One is, philanthropies can be very parochial, right? And they each have their, we want to work on this issue in this place. And so one of the things we're trying to do in the infrastructure exchange, and I would really recommend to you as local leaders, is go in knowing what your strategy is, right? Here's the thing I want to fund. Be open to maybe saying, okay, if you want to do it in this neighborhood, we can take this, we can pilot it there, but don't be too deferential in terms of what your strategy, because ultimately, I think you can find the right foundations and hopefully push them. I think part of the thing, the second point would be, part of what will help you get there, and I see this, we had the conversation we just had upstairs before this, and I saw it. Laurel and I worked together. We ran the Sandy recovery effort after Sandy hit the New York, Connecticut, New Jersey region. One of the huge challenges is when you talk to the 37 municipalities along the Jersey coast and the Long Island coast, those folks don't have the capacity that the mayor of Kansas City does, right? And if you can go to funders and say, look, this isn't just about one small community. We've built a coalition in our state, in our region, of 37 small communities. And this is where New Deal can be incredibly helpful, and other groups like this, is if you can bring the power of, hey, try something with us, and we'll get to test it more broadly, I think it's a real advantage in going to those local philanthropies. And by the way, it makes a ton of sense not to reinvent the wheel each time. I remember small Jersey communities who have one infrastructure person, right, in their entire workforce saying, wait a second, you want me to put in place green infrastructure that's going to stop the next, like, this is Greek to me, right? And so the way to get around that is to build a coalition where you can bring technical assistance, but that will also be a huge draw, I think, for philanthropy.
Well, disappointingly, but not surprisingly, time has flown, so we're almost at the end. But I want to ask one more very practical question on behalf of this audience. What would each of you recommend as the best thing to read, to follow, to listen to stay current on the most recent happenings on these things, to keep up with our uncles?
So one of the Mitch Landrieu was here yesterday because he had to accompany President Macron to New Orleans today. New Orleans is the most French city in America, I think. But he's a close friend. I am working very, very closely with them. One of the things I would tell you is use the resources that the White House is putting together. They have calls, they have documentation, they have a huge range of stuff that they're putting out. And frankly, go back to our communications conversation, I'm not sure they're advertising it well enough that you all hear about it enough. Yeah. So figure out a person on your team, stay in touch, and make sure somebody from your team is on those calls, looking at those documents on a regular basis, because there's a lot of super helpful information that they're putting out.
That's great. Anything from either of you?
Gosh, I don't know the answer yet, because really the plethora of sources are what's always most important to me. But if I were, picking out one, I always do like to get closer to the electorate. And to the Secretary's point, to perhaps understand how they are understanding what's happening with federal funding. And so it seems very simple, but if you have the time to catch the 4 to 5 minutes of whatever your national evening news segments of choice are, and to hear how they have explained what the president has done in connection with an investment, it tells you where you may have, in some ways, more work to do. Mm-hmm. So if they say there are all these dollars available going towards such, then you'll understand, all right, well, there's some availability, but it's important for us to find some way to make that hyper-relevant to the people of Kansas City. And so for me, I think that's usually where I guess I'm creating a litmus test of some sort, in addition to having, if you're blessed to have it, a staff that certainly is looking at whatever comes out of the White House, having folks that are in touch with your congressional offices and your state agencies to make sure that you'll be ready to deploy, I think, in the most effective way. I'll also say just very briefly, as to the last question, and this is perhaps easier for cities rather than states, trying to create brand consistency in your approach to grants and applications is so key. The hardest job I have probably right now as mayor is getting the disparate organizations, some of which we control, some of which we don't, to actually say this is what Kansas City is working on, rather than some of the many disparate viewpoints, infrastructure questions that are more connected to unique economic development projects. And so as you create that, I think that's key. And then actually now this gets me to the answer, right? If you know that what you're looking at or looking for is a way to rebuild and connect communities, that suggests to you that more work, more media that's actually speaking on those, other cities that are doing that, is going to be your guide to what you need to do long term. And it makes your Google search as much easier as you're saying, wait, who is doing this well?
A resource that I think is a good go-to is Results for America, which is really focused on evidence-based policy and how do you make that happen on a state and a local level. I think they're really smart. I also would give a shout out to Bloomberg Philanthropies, particularly for cities, where they have regular pieces that they're putting out about sort of innovation on the ground.
And to add my own answer to this same question, I would go to the other end rather than short things. Occasionally, even all of you who are so busy might be able to find time to read a book. And I would recommend to you Mariana Mazzucato's book called Mission Economy. She's an Italian economist who I always come back to her really effective argument or retort to the common thing we've all heard around government's job is to level the playing field. She says, no, 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 government's job is to tip the playing field in the direction of desired outcomes, which has always appealed to me and I think is really consistent with what we're hearing from this panel. So read that one, keep doing this work, keep supporting these folks, and we'll keep supporting you. Let's thank everybody for being part of this panel.